straw beds, and fur blankets. The words alone summon images of warm rustic comfort, a glowing hearth nearby, timber beams overhead, and someone wrapped in animal skin drifting into sleep. But stop for a moment. Imagine if I told you that those piles of straw were often alive with lice that fur. Coverings could give off the smell of mold and slow decay, and that the things we now see as charming were once symbols of hardship survival and at times pure desperation. This is not the Middle Ages from storybooks. This is the reality of what people faced when winter settled in and warmth meant the thin line between living and dying. So tonight, we settle into a bed filled with straw, we cover ourselves with fur, and we uncover a truth that is unsettling, one that medieval comfort never wanted you to sense. In the season of bitter cold in medieval Europe, a bed was not simply a place to lie down. It was a place where you fought to stay alive. For millions across the continent, the winter season was cruel. Thick stone walls held the cold inside. Windows, if there were any at all, had no clear panes. And fireplaces filled with smoke often gave off more fumes than heat. There were no electric heaters, no soft layered mattresses, and certainly no warm baths to ease you into sleep. So people relied on what the natural world could offer. Straw and animal fur were the simplest and most reachable forms of insulation for the poor and even for those of higher rank. But these materials were far from neutral. Straw beds and fur coverings were not ordinary bedding. They revealed class, health, anxiety, and clever adaptation. They told a deeper story, one that shows how fragile, inventive, and uncomfortable medieval life truly was. Let us start with straw, one of the most common sleeping materials across medieval homes. At first, it appears practical. Straw was cheap and easy to gather. You could collect it after the harvest, fill a sack with it, and lift yourself above the ground at night. Compared to the hard, damp floor of stone or wood, it felt like a major improvement. But here is the real story. A straw bed was never truly clean. People did not replace the stuffing every week, or even every month. The same mound of straw might stay under a person for many months, sometimes for an entire year, depending on their situation. The only thing that might be changed was the sheet or covering on top, if one even existed. Straw beds were more than sleeping places. They were small worlds of their own, filled with mites, beetles, lice, fleas, and things far worse. Many poor families did not own raised frames, so their straw rested directly on the floor, where it soaked up moisture, decayed from underneath, and at times even froze during the most frigid nights. Why did people continue to rely on straw? Because they had no real alternative. And because, for all its faults, straw kept heat near the body. It lifted the sleeper slightly away from the colder surface. And it made a person feel, even briefly, that the winter outside could not touch them. It was the medieval version of surviving with the least costly method, not because it was good, but because it was the least terrible choice they had. If you were poor in the Middle Ages, sleeping on straw was not an option among many. It was the only way to stay alive. But survival had a price. A living, itching, crawling price. Straw was seldom replaced. Cleanliness as we know it today did not exist. People did not beat the bedding or shake it out on a regular basis. As time passed, the straw broke apart, settled into a dense layer, and held everything inside it. Dust, body oils, crumbs, animal fur, and sweat collected in the mass. And with all of that came vermin. Mites, lice, bedbugs, and fleas thrived in the mix. The straw acted like an entire lodging for parasites, and they fed on the people who slept there every single night. Even worse, these creatures were more than simple irritants. They carried illness. Fleas and lice were not only bothersome. They played roles in the spread of typhus, relapsing fever, and at times played a part in plague outbreaks. Your pile of straw could easily become your place of death. People scratched themselves until they bled. Children developed sores. Old injuries grew infected. Yet few protested because they had nothing to compare it with. There was no idea of clean bedding, no boiling water, no disinfectant of any kind. A straw bed might cause itching, but it was still better than lying on frozen stone. And in the medieval world, better than nothing often meant it counted as acceptable. If straw was used by the poor, fur was used by the desperate and at times the rich. Animal skins from sheep, goat, fox, and even talk-by creatures were used to create coverings, linings, and sleeping wraps. Not because they were symbols of luxury, but because fur held warmth better than any other material available at the time. But furs carried their own unpleasant truths. First, they cost a great deal. Most peasants could not purchase full fur coverings. They might only have scraps or a thin sheepskin wrap. A complete animal pelt, such as from a wolf or bear, was a marker of status. In some regions, only the elite were allowed by local rules to wear certain furs. And even when commoners obtained fur, it was not always pleasant to use. But here is the truth. We still struggle with rest. In the 21st century, we fight sleeplessness, tension, noise, and worry. Not because of freezing air, but because of storms inside the mind. We stay awake not from hunger, but from fear. But one thing has not changed. Sleep is still a search for calm. A moment when the body and the world should become silent. And often they do not. The medieval world reveals something uncomfortable. Comfort is delicate. Warmth is a privilege. And sleep, more than anything else, reflects the structure of the society around us. 7 centuries have passed. Yet in many places today, for the poor, the displaced, the cold, a peaceful night remains a rare gift. So what lesson should we gather from this? That medieval sleep was harsh? That straw caused itching and fur gave off strong odors? That the poor froze while the rich stayed only slightly warmer? Yes, all of that. But perhaps the deeper truth behind straw bedding and fur coverings is not merely discomfort. It is endurance. Every night in the Middle Ages, someone pulled on a rough wool garment, curled into damp straw, and looked up at timbers stained black with smoke. They heard rats nearby. They scratched at their skin. They trembled, and still passed away. Yet they rested. They rested because there was no alternative. They rested because their bodies demanded pause, even when the world offered nothing close to comfort. They rested because making it to sunrise was triumph enough. And when we look at those fur coverings and piles of straw today, behind museum glass or in dreamy medieval stories, perhaps we should pause and acknowledge what they truly represent. They were not simply tools for warmth. They were quiet and persistent acts of endurance. A nightly stand against freezing air, fear, and darkness. So tonight, when you pull your blanket over yourself, when you breathe in the feeling of safety and warmth, remember that once a bed was not a place of calm, but a battlefield. And the people who rested in those conditions were not fragile. They were not simple. They were survivors, one cold night at a time. History is often taught through battles, rulers, and waves of disease. But at times the small things reveal far more about a world than the famous events. A pile of straw can teach us as much as a royal decree. A rough fur covering or a damp stack of hay carries stories that official records never mention. They reveal how people adjusted to hardship, how they endured, and how they found moments of rest in a world that rarely cared for comfort. In a life with no options, no warmth, and no peace, people still lay down each night and chose to keep going. And maybe that is the strongest part of all. When I wrote this piece, I was not thinking only of the distant past. I was thinking of people alive right now, those sleeping on sidewalks in large cities, those sitting under blankets during long power outages, and even myself, someone who never questioned the presence of a comfortable bed. It is easy to romanticize times long gone. But once you understand that a blanket once stood for survival itself, you begin to see your own comfort as a quiet form of privilege. And if the past teaches me anything, it is this. People do not need perfection to show strength. They need only the resolve to lie down, close their eyes, and trust that morning will arrive. Badly prepared furs smelled strongly. The scent was harsh and animal-like. They could become moldy in damp weather. They shed loose hair. And they also carried fleas, the same insects that lived in straw bedding. Women had fur stitched into night garments or outer cloaks. Children sometimes shared a single piece of fur among several siblings. For older people, a piece of fur could decide whether they woke up shivering or did not wake at all. There was a mental element to it as well. Wrapping yourself in fur made you feel closer to the creatures that lived outdoors. You were not only staying warm, you were surviving as an animal might. Fur was not a fashion statement. It served as armor against wind, against frost, against death itself. You might imagine that once wrapped in fur and resting on straw, you would finally be protected. You were not, because medieval homes were not only cold, they were filled with dampness. Water collected on stone walls. Timber beams dripped with moisture. And the bedding, especially when kept close to the floor, absorbed that wetness the way a sponge does. Straw could decay, grow fungus, and give off a sour earthy scent that clung to clothing and hair. Some peasants mixed herbs, such as lavender or mint, into the straw to cover the odor, but herbs did not stop the rot. Fur coverings also needed regular care. If stored the wrong way, they grew mold, attracted insects, or stiffened until they felt like rigid boards. If placed too close to a flame while drying, they could catch fire. And that brings us to yet another danger: open flames. Most medieval dwellings used candles, small braziers, or simple hearths for heat. That meant fire was always close to the sleeping area, sometimes directly beside it, sometimes even within the bedding when pots of embers were tucked under stones. A spark landing on loose straw or a candle falling onto fur could cause catastrophe in moments. A peaceful night could turn into tragedy in seconds. There were no alarms, no fire-resistant bedding, no prepared water buckets by the sleeping area. When fire started, and it often did, families had only a brief moment to act. Many failed. In the attempt to stay warm, people lived in constant danger between comfort and catastrophe. Across medieval Europe, even the way people slept carried political weight. The manner of sleeping, the location, the materials, and the company reflected a person's social class. And during winter, these differences became divisions of survival. Members of the nobility slept on raised frames built of wood, with mattresses filled with feathers, and most importantly, curtains that offered privacy. Thick curtains enclosed their beds, not for decoration, but to hold warm air inside. Furs were placed in layers. In some castles, servants warmed heavy stones or plates of iron in the hearth and placed them between sheets before their masters went to sleep. Now compare that to a peasant. A poor family might sleep on a simple mound of straw on the ground, shared by 3 or 4 people. There was no mattress, perhaps one rough blanket, and certainly no private space. Children often slept with goats, dogs, or chickens to share body heat. The warmth was not a luxury. It was required for survival. Among the middle ranks of society, the artisans and traders who formed the steady heart of towns, life rested between 2 extremes. They might own raised beds and perhaps a bit of fur if they were fortunate, but they never enjoyed full protection from the cold. Even inside wealthy estates, the hierarchy shaped every detail. Household servants slept in passageways or on thin pallets set beside doorways. The lower your standing, the nearer you slept to the drafts. Warmth was more than comfort. It was influence. And each night a person was reminded that their place in society dictated their chances of survival. Let us sink even lower to those who lived on the very edge. The landless, the wanderers, the beggars, the abandoned children. The people without shelter or living in failing cottages of thatch, far from any manor house. For them, even a bundle of straw was a gift. They slept directly on the earth, often clinging to one another for heat. Clothes were never taken off. They served both as outfits for daily work and coverings for sleep. Blankets were rare. A single wool shawl or a patched tunic might be the only layer between the body and the winter air. During colder nights, they slept in shifts. One person stayed awake to tend the weak fire, if one existed at all. The others curled close to whatever warmth the embers produced. Some families rotated their places through the night. The young were placed in the center. The older members rested on the outer edges where the chill was sharpest. Blankets were not simple belongings. They were treasured items. Passed down, fought over, repaired again and again. A strong wool covering could be valued at more than a full week of labor. And when the cold turned brutal, some people dug into piles of straw meant for animals, hiding within them and praying for warmth. They did not sleep to relax. They slept to survive. Now pause for a moment. Think about your own bed, your own layers, the temperature control in your room, the mattress chosen for comfort, the scented spray on your pillow, the idea of keeping a routine for better rest. And now imagine trying to sleep while shaking with cold, watching your breath rise like smoke, feeling a flea bite your ankle, and hearing a rat scratching beneath you. It is easy to smile at the distance between their world and ours.